Hello again, everyone. My name is Daniel Barber. Most of you know me, Associate Professor and Chair of the PhD program at the Weitzman School of Design. Very happy this evening to introduce Marc Miller to give what I think is the last of the Surface Summer School talks, right?
We have one more on Monday.
One more. Oh, okay, great. Well, the penultimate then of these talks, which I know have been a very rich part of the summer project, and we're really happy to have Marc with us today. Marc has degrees in art history and fine arts from Binghamton University, as well as a Master of Architecture from the University of Virginia, and a Master in Landscape Architecture from Cornell. He teaches at Penn State in the Department of Landscape Architecture, and prior to teaching worked in a number of architectural practices. His research focuses on relationships between design, environments, and media. He's interested in how world building and narratives can be used to enhance the speculative nature of design, in particular relative to climate change and dystopian landscapes. As part of this, he's interested in the representation of landscapes on popular media platforms, serial television and apps and other media arenas. So really looking forward to the talk. And of course, after Marc's presentation, we'll open up to questions yeah, so please jot down your notes, and we'll look forward to coming back together and having a great discussion. So Marc, take it away.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Winka. Thank you to the folks at the Weitzman School of Design. Thank you to the folks at Service Magazine for your efforts and your time in coordinating this lecture series for your students and for the competition. I would like to also take a moment to give a shout out to all the students and the efforts that you all are going through. And I know this is there are so many euphemisms you can use to describe what you're going through. But I would like to commend you all for your persistence and your continued interest in design as a way to focus both on issues of what's happening around you and also to internalize what's happening at the same time. So with that, I'm going to start my lecture. We have to go through the usual pause. So please bear with me. Okay, and all right. So as was mentioned, this is the second to last lecture of the series related to the summer studio, and there's a lot going on with this design problem, if you really sit down and think about it. And you all have, but take a moment to really take a deep breath and a moment of repose and think about all the complexities related to it. There are issues of precedent, there are issues of the past, the present, and the future that are going on in all of this. And I'm actually in the fortunate position of not having to worry about presenting precedents to you or presenting solutions. You've already seen a great deal of people who have some fantastic ideas for you, fantastic approaches. So instead, I'm going to try to take you out of your comfort zones and out of the usual box that you're in of thinking, in order to get you to critique your projects while you're finishing them up. And after Monday, when they've been submitted at 12 o'clock, you can stand back and look at them and think about them in a different tone. And that tone is the position of being someone else, a person, a civilian, a citizen. I'm going to frame this specifically in the context of North America, given some of my research, but instead of being a professional, I want you to think about yourself and decenter yourselves as individuals who are going to use these spaces, or how these individuals, these people who'd use these stations, would interact with the places you're making. And in thinking about this and setting up, there are a number of approaches, but I wanted to start off by asking a little simple thing about how you imagine people cherishing your project. And I'm going to use these two older precedents as examples. The first is the Temporary American Center in Paris by Atelier Sergio, that was standing from 1991 to 1994. And this was a temporary construction, as mentioned, in a very awkward spot. But because of the design, the rigor of the design, and some of the compelling aspects of it, it became something that was loved by the people around it and the owner occupants. So it was eventually taken away and stored. And one of the other reasons why it's interesting is because it presents many of the early issues that we see in prefabricated construction and using materials off the shelf in the most economical manner possible in order to make what was essentially a unique space based off of the constraints. In contrast, we have the wishing bench, which was constructed by the Studio 501 by the University of Kansas in Lawrence, Kansas, which was a prefabrication or a fabrication project and service project from the university that was placed in a neighborhood in Lawrence and completed in 2008. Immediately after it was constructed, this is what happened. The neighborhood took claim of it and turned it into something that neither the faculty member or the students imagined would ever happen with their projects. So this is kind of a proposition I want you to think about as you look and think about the longer lives of your testing stations, because these are very real things that can happen. Projects can get out of your hands, and do get out of your hands over time. And by that, I think you need to consider fundamentally the difference between creativity and imagination. Creativity, you're no doubt going through right now, thinking about what are the intricacies, how do you make these immediate relationships with program versus space and form and material fabrication conditions or constraints. But then there's the imagination part of it, right? How does this thing get occupied? How do people live in it? How does it get away from you? Or conversely, how do you start to tell additional stories with the thing? And we've been doing this for a long time, dealing with these complex issues of how we begin to construct stories, construct ideas, or to narrate ideas. From one of the more popular rationalizations of this is from Herbert Simon, The Models of Man, where we talk about these three basic components about how we deal with information. And we tell these stories as designers as well. How we begin to organize and make information implicit and clear to our user groups in order for them to understand the larger concepts and think across scales. And we do that through the construction directly, explicitly, but we also do that through representation and the image making at the same time, right? So as a landscape architect, I constantly refer to Humphrey Repton and the Red Books, which were these narrative structures where there was a combination of text describing the intent of the project and these images. So we have a before and after here where Repton is illustrating this is what the space, what the landscape looks like, and this is the view. And if you follow the recommended guidelines that he's proposing in this particular red book, the image on the bottom is what you will get as this picturesque moment that begins to open up the landscape and also control the landscape at the same time. Because there are also issues of politics, economy, class and power embedded in these images as well. But one interesting thing that we need to keep in mind in all of this, or something that I tend to reference, is that this is also one of the first, arguably one of the first moments where we see landscape animated or architecture animated, because it's a flip book. So there's this explanation of the before and after, the complexities that Herbert Simon references much later, granted, but the things he's referencing are revealed or explained through the taking of the flaps and folding them in to see what the after effect is, right? So we see this this change and this transformation based off of the narrative, which explains the intention in one way and these images in another way, but it's the actual act of animating that that allows you to process the changes and the proposals as part of the thing. Another example, a more architectural example, would be the work of Sebastiano Sergio and his early work on theaters, on theaters and opera spaces. And this is one of the earlier pieces or proposals that he created. One of the scenes for a theater. This is the tragic scene or backdrop. And the whole notion was that these backdrops, and there are two more, there's the comic and the satirical, but these backdrops were intended to support the narrative, but at the same time, they're also intended to suggest proper behavior. So here we have an architect basically saying, not only am I going to give you a setting, an ideal situation, an urbanism, if you will, I'm also going to construct it in a way that we make associations between where we are and how we should be behaving. Architects beginning to tell people or imply to people through representation what proper manners are in particular places. So this is this power that we have, or that we hope we have, but we tend to not necessarily take advantage of enough, or think about it critically as part of the process, because there's so many other factors that are confronting us. Those are typically technical or immediate, but then there are these larger long-term things, thinking ahead. What does this thing do in 10, 15, 20, 100 years? How does it perform? So I'd like you to think about your project, not necessarily in the 100-year scale, but for those of you who are making these things that have a certain level of permanence, what happens to that box or that shape, that form, whatever's happening with it afterwards, and what's the long tail of it as not just as a piece of architecture, but as a cultural artifact. And with that in mind, I'd like to shift slightly and talk about it in terms of a larger context. And by that context, I'm talking about the fact that we're dealing with a global pandemic, right? And I hope you were all aware of the reference of the small, medium, large, extra large to the book by Rem Koolhaas and organized by Bruce Mau, or the book designed by Bruce Mau. But I'd like to think of this not necessarily as a series of architecture proposals, but as a series of landscape scales. And extra large being the largest point, being the global pandemic, because we can't get any larger at this point at any rate, but also thinking about COVID-19 stations as the small, and how you begin to work across those things. So you can use immediate precedents like follies, like the Occupy, or I'm sorry, the parking day structures designed by the design firm Rebar. You could look at prefabricated shelters like the one for Puma, which deals with serial things, right? So we have this situation where in one instance, you're constructing something that's a one-off. It's a very, very unique thing that is meant to gain attention through its craft and the unique nature of that craft, or using a serial construction that is based off of a standard unit that we're all very familiar with, but then changing it up and also making it as part of a family, as part of a system. I would contend that we can't necessarily rely upon these simple physical formal constructions, because in the end, what we're dealing with is a representation of the state. So using these conventional approaches aren't aren't always appropriate, and we have to start to dig deeper and to think about the history of how people interact with spaces, both socially, culturally, and thirdly, politically, as part of the construction or design intention of projects, and also the reflection on it as well. So it's this long tail that I'm thinking about, and these patterns that I want you to consider, right? That we have seen these long lineups based on the limitation of resources for decades on end. This is on the left, an image by Margaret Bork Wright, completed in 1937 after the Great Flood in Louisville. Incidentally, the same Louisville where we had a instance of voter suppression. So we see these patterns still playing out against particular faces, and the contrasts that are already illustrated in that photograph playing out over the long term. Compared to this more recent photograph of people standing in line with masks, dealing with the pandemic, and trying to do their best with their lives as possible. So we can see this persistence in these patterns and this asymmetry of power and these modes of representation that begin to pull through and create translations of how we begin to see things or how we have or have not dealt with projects. So going back to this problem, right, of how we are constructing spaces, I'd like to think about it again in 3 terms. I'd like to think about it in the past, or the present, the past, and the precedent. And as part of that, I'd like to bring up put some other people in the context of this argument as I go along. So thinking about mapping and geography as ways of constructing spaces, and not necessarily the physical geography, but the culture geography and the implications of representation versus the construction of precision and the implied need for that, and why we feel the need to work down to such minuscule points using software such as Rhino in order to get everything exact when there are much messier things that we have to deal with as part of the process. So there are 2 people who that come to mind when I think about this, and the first is Dennis Cosgrove and his work on culture geography and this process of mapping and trying to control things using image. And that landscape and representation have been long projects, and in landscape architecture design is part of that control process. In contrast would be the work of Francesca Hughes in her book, Architecture of Error, Matter, Measure, and the Misadventures of Precision. She mentions this, she questions the need for this precision and why we're looking at it. And I would contend that there's a safety and there's a comfort in dealing with the precision when looking out at that larger scale that Cosgrove mentions becomes a problem or something that's hard to imagine because it requires you to speculate and imagine what's happening. So in thinking about both those things in these terms, we have these contemporary mapping projects that try to be as precise as possible about place and numbers, right? So we're seeing the relatively recent, this was taken yesterday, the relative numbers or representation of severity of impacts of COVID-19 on particular regions in the United States. And we see this, and we can grasp this information fairly quickly based off of the red. So we have this ability, it's taking advantage of our ability to see in contrast and in saturation to say, oh, these are spaces where I should be aware of, or these are spaces that I should not be traveling in, versus those spaces which are relatively safe based off of what's being represented and assumptions. So it's essentially explaining risks and also beginning to define boundaries and spaces in a number of different ways. And it's also describing these things in a very dynamic way as it goes on from day to day in this update. Zooming down, though, very fast, if we look at Philadelphia, we see a different way of representing this information. We also see a different grain, right? And there are a couple interesting things happening here. The first is the mode representation changes from something that is fairly polished and slick and clean in its precision and its resolution to something that is based off of political boundaries and is based off of a fairly ambiguous representation of percentages or average numbers in those boundaries as well. But if we compare these things, like if we compare these two maps to a map based off of income and a map based off of racial data. So if we look at the image on the right, that's the concentration of African Americans in Philadelphia as compared to the rest of the region. And the image on the left is about income. So we see the blue are the high points in both those images. We can compare these to both these maps to make connections about where the cases are appearing and who is being impacted with these cases. And we can also compare those to where the testing stations are. So here we have 48 stations, and those 48 stations don't necessarily align themselves with with the locations of severe outbreaks. So the point here is that there's an asymmetry, right? I mentioned that earlier, that there's this asymmetry of power and control and manipulation that you have to deal with. And I'm asking this question because it's a matter of asking yourself, where would your station be? Is it in one of the outlying regions? Is it along the riverfront? Is it further back? Is it on a border? Is it near Bryn Mawr? Where are these spaces? Because that also impacts the type of architecture you make. Context matters as part of that process. In addition to that, we think about these dynamics and how they're controlled as part of a mapping process, right? It's not the flatness that we assume or the level playing field isn't necessarily as accurate as we think, because there's a whole notion of the dynamic that this author, Norbert Wiener, mentions or thinks about in these two books, these contrasting books, Cybernetics, which is very much the way we think about things and design computationally as a process of thinking either through programming or thinking things through a grammar that is based through a series of beginning and manipulation and end, to the manipulation of people or how we control people using systems. And we can see that that's been a long-standing thing, a part of a tradition that has occurred for quite some time, which is evident, evident in the work of GIS. Firstly, Roger Tomlinson, when he starts the GIS project in the early 1960s, and this particular video that's a campaign for why GIS is an effective system or a valuable system to solve the woes and ills of central Canada and the economic limitations. So in the video, there are a range of things that are illustrated, namely technology, the process of using that technology, but there's never a real clear application of who that technology is being applied to. So thinking about these things and being very clear about how we map things out or how these constructions work is something that's very important. And understanding who we're hitting and how, and the prioritization, right? So data is not flat, it is not unbiased, it is even the construction and the layering of it also begins to construct notions of implicit bias and how you begin to organize a framework to create results that give you a particular outcome. This is a tool begins to support that and becomes a persistent long tail. And we're using that information, that data, in order to make decisions about where these sites are located, and as a result, also beginning to consider how the design works or how these things are manifest over time. To give you a sense of how precise this information become, can become. It can be incredibly demanding, or not speculative, but exact in how it describes things, right? So they're not just, it's not just a matter of numbers, it's also a matter of narratives. So here we have the area that y'all are very fairly familiar with, described with a clarity, with a really pithy clarity of who those people are. And if you need to, you can look at these things a little closer and talk about them in that precise nature. And those notions of who we are, what our neighbor is, and the traits are not necessarily things that are meant to be used in a reflective manner. These are things that are being used in a speculative manner, right? So people are constructing things based off of this, namely architecture, namely development. These are tools of control. These are stories that begin to give people a clue how they can impact a place or create a new future on top of those. But for a moment, before I move on to the next part, I'd like to pause on those numbers again. And I'd like to pause on them because I'd like to point out the fact that they're rising. And this is another problem that y'all are implicitly dealing with in your project. Namely, that you don't know the life of your projects and how long they'll last and how they'll impact people from now to the future. So there's this potential for them to be very valuable artifacts of a short period of time, or to be very valuable pieces of social fabric for a much longer time, to the point where they become permanent. And how they become permanent is important as part of time, architecture and time, because then we also have to think about who they're impacting or who's learning from them and how those groups evolve. And this brings up another point of asymmetry, where we have this change, this gradual change in how the racial makeup of the United States is changing over time. And by 2050, it is predicted, or even by 2045, it is predicted that the United States will be a minority white nation, which has a range of implications on top of it. But if you're thinking about how you would interact with people over the long term with this tiny little space, it also begins to apply where the story's coming from, where your precedent's coming from, and who the stories are for. Right? You don't want to make something that's very flat. If you imagine it being something that's going to be permanent, you want it to be fairly specific to a place or something that it's engaging as part of the process. So the stories you tell, the imaginative components you have constructed in your project are important in developing a relationship with the people around them and constructing memories, not just around your piece of architecture, but around the place in general and how it begins to build itself up. On top of that is, so we have these numbers, but here's what it really looks like, right? And this is a piece of a photography project by Martin Scholler for National Geographic, where he took the demographic speculations and began to map them out, not based off of location or a bar chart, but actually using faces, right? So if you think about it in a really direct set of terms, the architecture or the history, the pedagogy, so many of the things you're looking at today in 30 years will not have the same relationship to the people that will be looking at it, right? So your architecture doesn't necessarily have to be static. It can also look towards those people that will be occupying the future or remember and respecting it. And being projective in the same way the developer is using the mapping, you can use this information in order to tell stories to people of the future in addition to people of the present. In thinking about this and figuring out how to get there, there's a question of past and precedent. And I think we need to be very clear that there's not a lot of, but there are conversations or comments and moments where people have said, there are no precedents for this. Let's be clear, there are precedents for it. 1918, the Spanish influenza, and depending on how you think about it, if you use some of the current arguments, it would be the American outbreak because of the location where it was first identified, provides with a valuable precedent about how we began to behave. Not necessarily the results, but how we began to approach things and the services we provide, and also some of the speculative solutions. So we have a notion of what the architectures can be. We have a notion of how these things work out based off of maintenance and care that we can look at and begin to bring that forward. But we also have senses of scale. We have senses of scale through the work of Stuart Brand when he was looking at the initial mapping. So if we go back to Dennis Cosgrove's organization of the world through representation and the globe, Stuart Brand is asking the question, why haven't we seen a photograph of the whole Earth yet, knowing full well they existed, right? The information is there, but it's not being provided to us. There's a veil in front of it. And he's asking the question of how we can get to that for the benefit of everybody, instead of it being a very small niche, in this case NASA, as part of that. And eventually, as part of his protests, he was able to get an image from a satellite photograph from 1967. It was taken in 1967, which he used for the 1968 Whole Earth catalog. And it's an interesting point that he's using this, talking about this large scale, again, the way y'all are thinking, about this large scale of the globe, the pandemic, or the entire Earth, as a way to make recommendations or to provide individuals with ways to, using contemporary terms, hack the world around them. So it was a piece of counterculture. It was a piece of rebellion built into a magazine format that allowed people to find resources that would help allow them to better their lives, not based off of what was allowed to them, but based off of what was available. It wasn't until 1972 that the actual photograph was taken, as an aside. So there's this whole jump in scale in time where we see this technology being used to represent or to document a thing remotely. And it wasn't until several years later there was an actual physical group of people who used a camera on a shuttle or a capsule in order to appropriately document this. So we have this past, we have this notion of how we think about large to small, right? This is something that's happened in the past repeatedly, and it's also the relationship of how we begin to represent, use technology to both record and represent the people who are being concerned. And what resolution does this happen becomes part of it. And again, these are all things that are becomes very important in understanding what the long-term, the life of your project is, and how it might play out. What are the stories that are embedded in it as part of that process? This gets us to the final part, precedent. I would say at this point, instead of looking directly back and saying this is what it needs to be based off of the first two images of the Puma shelter or the Puma pop-up or the parking day limousine, if you will, I would argue that we need to look at things a little more contemporarily. And we need to look at the things that people look at as tools, as points of references, in order to understand both what people are thinking and also how we can take advantage of shelters and what they can mean to people, both conceptually and spatially, in order to make proposals. And by this, I mean looking at things that are signifiers in culture, and things that are readily accessible as precedents, in a passive manner and sometimes in an active manner. And that, I would argue, would be television, because it's so widely accessible to people, and it begins to transplant itself in front of going to a museum to receive culture, more as compared to earlier periods of time when people would go to the salon, the art salon, in order to look at a wall of paintings to understand what is good, what is high culture, and then to provide feedback. It is now the Netflix, what your list on Netflix is as you go forward. But even beyond that, there are all these little subtleties, like how these things are translating in contemporary culture. The notion of information, right? How people begin to construct ideas that are critiques of things we take for granted and how we manipulate them. So here we have in Westworld, this is a documentation of time that is both a critique of data and the way it is used against people in contemporary terms, but it also begins to set up a series of stories, world building, if you will, that begins to support or sets up all the events of the third season of the series. So these are the information that we're dealing with, the zeros and the O's, the dots, the bits, the things we saw earlier on with the New York Times being transformed into something radically different, but being used in a way that begins to challenge and question how that information is used against us. And it becomes part of the story, but there's this larger notion of how that information is being used against people in an asymmetrical manner currently as well. But there are other ways to do this, right? There are other ways to think about how that architecture works beyond looking at it as a form of data. The construction of the speculative nature of constructing architecture. Excuse me, I don't know what happened there. How architecture becomes something that's part of the future. Here we have the future of Los Angeles, as described by or as curated or consulted by Bjarke Ingels in the construction of the story and the spaces of season 3 of Westworld. In contrast, we have the much starker image of landscape in the same season, and the future of Paris in this instance, and how that begins to transform the lives of the individual. Right, so here we have this extreme of this resolution between these 3 images in one series, in one season, of going from zeros and O's to the level of the individual and how those actions transform their lives over the course of a season. At a more specific scale, because I understand that I recognize that this is a much larger scale, the scale of landscape, at a specific scale of the booth, we can look towards Watchmen also produced by HBO, where we have these, for all intents and purposes, old-fashioned telephone booths where people can contact Dr. Manhattan and ask for hope and wishes while he has sequestered himself on Mars. So here we have architecture being a form of hope, and also this strange retro new technology being built into it as part of the representation in the storyline and within the series itself to the audience, right? Because we're looking at the present, but it looks like something in the future, but it's based off of these things that happened in the past, transforming how we see things as a tool, so we reflect on the spaces around us, and again pulling ourselves out and looking at the screen, looking at it as an audience, beginning to transform how we look at the spaces around us and our history. In this case, Watchmen specifically addresses issues of racism and terrorism that occur in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and persist throughout the season. And there's this wonderful transformation at the end, what I won't go into, but the use of architecture becomes very important and part of that process. The next one to consider would be Tales from the Loop. And I would say that this is probably one of the most direct forms of architectural application that you can think about, because we see architecture constantly being used in the series as a trope, right? These are things that happen in the background. And the scale of the object, the scale of the things you're making arguably would have it placed in the background. But that doesn't mean that it can't have transformative moments, right? These are things that begin to drastically affect the lives of the people that are around them. If people have watched the series, you know the things I'm pointing to. For those who haven't, I'm not going to give things away. But these moments, these things, which look very mundane, and you can see the patina on them and how used they are, they're everyday objects that are placed in sites, in landscapes, and taken for granted. But the power of these things to transform the long lives, the long tail after their placement, is a very important component. And I would say that thinking about your projects, not just now, but thinking about that long tail of impact afterwards becomes a very important part of them. All this to say, there are other ways to critique your projects, right? And by this, I'm referencing this, again, we have the image from Sergio, but superimposed on it is a cakewalk. Cakewalks come from a long-standing tradition of enslaved people in the South, where they would provide commentary on the people in cities. So if you think about it in deeper terms, enslaved people were only allowed to occupy certain areas of cities. And if they were on plantations, it would be rare that they would have the opportunity to see what the city looked like. But when they did, they would come back and they would tell stories, narratives about the spaces around them and about the people around them. So the cakewalk is not just a celebration, it's a mimicry of the behavior of the people, the affluent, privileged people around them, right? So the notion of behavior and urbanism and proper behavior that Sergio supports falls apart because the lesser known critique, just as valid, but the lesser known critique of the space tells a very different story and begins to break down and illustrate the gaps in the behavior and the mannerisms of the people who are occupying the city. So that long tail in this transformation begins to resonate today. And this is the trickiest part of what you're dealing with, in that you can't just talk about one thing that's happening globally without talking about one thing that happened locally and became a global phenomenon, particularly in the context of mannerisms, behaviors, and the intentional restriction of behavior and mannerisms of Black people on streets, right? So you're not just dealing with the COVID-19, you're dealing with the death of George Floyd. So your COVID-19 stations begin to take on the role of the monument that this thing is being projected on, right, over the long term. What is the life of that thing? How do people engage with it? How do people begin to realize or acknowledge the relationship it has in situ with both the direct problem, but the contextual problem as well? Because this is a very big moment in time. It is a global moment in time that has a whole lot of things going on with it. And this has clearly become one of those additional things as part of the process. So how that thing becomes represented, or how it becomes celebrated or transformed into a different type of memorial, something that has a longer life, is a very important part of the process of making that you're going through and thinking about. And in the end, also thinking about how people can occupy it after the fact and make it into something that is theirs, right? So it may not have the life that the life you're giving it now, for its entirety, it might change into something else over the long term. That's not to say that there are other different types of precedents or ways of thinking about your project, these small moments, and who interacts with them and how they interact with them has to be at the scale of a memorial, and it doesn't always have to be within this narrow Western tradition. There are other lives for small things, right? You can think about these things in terms of the Jamaican sound system, which was at the same time a form of protest, or not at the same time, but was a form of social communication and engagement and information, right? Because these are folks who are essentially early DJs who are constructing or providing music to communities based off of reboots or lifts of original music that had not yet made it to the islands. But the sort of dissemination of this object or the value, the cultural value of this object becomes very rich and continues on to become part of cultural operations and activities in England and most notably in the United States, right? 1972, hip hop or rap music and DJing become something that's very prominent and known and a thing that we're all incredibly familiar with now. And they all revolve around those two things in the back, coffins. And they're referred to as coffins not because of what will happen, but because of the size, right? They're coffins, that's about the right size of an object that allows you to put all the equipment you need for a show or performance without it being too large, right? So there's this mobility, there's this transition, but the overall impact of that mobility and transition has been profound and has had a long life. So your small things might have much longer lives than what you imagine and might have more profound impacts on the communities that they're in, provided that they're responsive to those communities, you're attentive to them. And I'd also like to end by reminding you that there are even smaller things. There are much smaller architectures that have much more profound impacts on the places around us, right? This is the corner where George Floyd was shot and murdered. And it wasn't the building, it wasn't Cup Foods that did it for us, it wasn't the Speedway gas station that did it for us. It was the fact that a cell phone, a small thing that we all hold in our, or many of us hold in our pockets or our backpacks or our bags, that was the piece of architecture that was so transformative and made us aware of all these injustices. So you can work across scales, you can do all these different things, just remember the intention of how they work and how they relate to the communities around them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marc. That was very thoughtful, very engaging. I have a few thoughts and questions myself, but as usual, I want to give our students a chance to jump in and see if you have any questions or concerns or clarifications without sort of spoiling any, TV series endings, right? That's no spoiler alerts.
The subtlety in all of this is when you're done, 12:01, hit your Netflix queue.
That's
right. Relax.